So welcome to this lunch and learn. We're going to take probably, the next 45 minutes to talking about matrix gardening and a couple other things. So glad that you have an interest. Again, this is just an introduction to this, but hopefully to give you some resources to think about and some steps to take so you can continue your own gardening journey from there. All right, so first of all, I think it's important to talk a little bit about native and what it means when we use the word native, if we're talking about native plants or if we're talking about native bees or animals or anything else like that. So this is the definition I like to use. Plant or animal that has evolved in a given place over a period of time. All right, I think that's generally what everybody thinks about when they think about native. But more, maybe not more important, but also important is the next part, sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships within that environment and with other organisms there. So it's not enough to just live here. You have to be able to somehow work into some other type of relationships with other organisms around there too. So I think that's an important thing. If we think about these crazy spotted lanternflies and all, if in 50 years, if they're still here, are they native? Well, it depends. Have they developed into this type of relationship? Then maybe we could have that discussion. But they're pretty nasty to begin with here. But think about those two things. So it's not just living here for a long time, but it's about being part of the community. Something's coming and eating your leaves to sustain themselves, or something is going on that way as far as the web goes. So kind of keep that in mind. Benefits of native plants. First, to wildlife. Okay, so when we think about native plants, particularly things that bloom, we think of nectar and pollen. Bees, pollinators like butterflies and moths and stuff like that live off of nectar, that sugary water that they're pulling out of blooms, and then for bees, they're also gathering pollen, which is a rich source of protein to help with rearing their young and things along those lines. So obviously that's a value there too. There's other values that happen in native kind of ecosystems, and it's particularly when we're talking about specialist bees and specialist plants. There are some life cycles that happen where you have these bees that they, might have been hibernating, might have been eggs, and then they're born into the world at the exact time when a certain plant is coming into bloom, which is fascinating to think that the moment that these things are ready to pop on the plants, these bees are also popping, and then they can come and do that. And so these kind of specialist relationships are really, really important, really, really interesting, and certainly really important for both of those species, because if the bees miss the opportunity of when those plants are starting to bloom, then they could potentially, in some cases, starve. And the same goes for the plant. If the plant, if something happens and they don't get to bloom, then perhaps they're not pollinated, which means the next generation of their species, it's not going to happen either. So there's some interesting things that happen within native ecosystems. Is the idea of host plants. So if we look at this picture, we've got some swamp milkweed. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 monarchs. And then if you look in the back there, looks like a tiger swallowtail, the yellow one. Obviously here you could look and say that the milkweed is offering, nectar, pollen, things along those lines. But then also milkweeds are host plants for caterpillars, for monarch caterpillars. Okay. If a monarch would, place an egg on an oak leaf, like that caterpillar is going to hatch and die because it can't eat oak leaves. It can only eat milkweed. And so for many moths and for many butterflies, there's this host plant relationship where they have to be able to find these plants. They have to be able to, place an egg on these plants, and those caterpillars have to be able to eat in order for the next generation to survive as well. There's also the idea of winter habitat. So, if we're talking about bees, oftentimes the first thing we think about are things like honeybees, and honeybees living in hives and living in managed hives and things along those lines. But that's just like one species of the almost 400 species that are found here in Pennsylvania. A lot of them live underground, some of them live all by themselves, but in some cases, particularly bumblebees, they use the bunch grasses that come up. In the wintertime, they get down into the crown there, and then they hibernate all winter. so that at the end of winter, they come back alive and then they start the process over again from there. So, there's all this type of habitats, and that's just one example of kind of hibernating bugs and hibernating pollinators and things along those lines. Now, for us, the use of native plants is that generally they're less fussy once established. Native plants that are kind of used to living around here are used to the weather that we get. They're used to cold, wet winters and hot, humid summers. They can live through freeze thaw cycles and things along those lines. So you don't have to be running out to cover them, in October if there's an early frost and things like that. They can pretty much take care of themselves once established. Use of native plants also means that there's going to be this ever-changing like parade of blooms as well too. So you have an opportunity to add more plants. Instead of just having one set of plants, like bedding plants, you get begonias or whatever. You have this opportunity to kind of add to it that way. And then there's better survivability. I mean, again, so, the more plants that you have, the better chance that they could survive. They're kind of used to our clay soils, they're used to our climate, and they're used to the predators that are around here too. So there's a better chance for them to survive. I want to mention too, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We're also asked people just where you're located. You could also put those in the chat as well. So matrix gardening, the reason you're here, I'm assuming. Matrix gardening, is this idea of trying to mimic nature in your gardening plan. A couple months ago, we had a lunch and learn on here about converting your lawn to a meadow. And if you did that, and maybe you dug up all your grass, and then you're looking at this big patch and you're thinking like, I don't know, what am I going to put here? Matrix gardening is a potential way to look at these things. I liked matrix gardening because number one, I love the way that it looks. It looks a little bit natural, but it also is kind of an efficient way to plan out where you're going to put stuff. Here's three kind of separate definitions. Sometimes you ask like a landscape architect or designer, and they give you like all this stuff. Generally speaking, matrix gardening, also known as modular gardening, wildscaping, natural design, natural garden design, all this other jazz. It's a multi-layered, sustainable garden plan that mimics natural grasslands and forests. It's a system using small plants, tightly plugged, put together very densely, into a living mulch. And then there's this idea of this 4-season garden aesthetic, meaning that every time you go out to your garden, it should be looking pretty darn good. It's not like a garden where it's like, oh, you should come back in August because that's the only time you should be here because X is blooming. There's this idea that even in the middle of December, even at, when it's really hot in July, even in late September, there's always something interesting to look at. Here's two examples of well-known matrix garden plans in action. On the left is the High Line in New York City. I was there a couple weeks ago at a conference. I got to take some coworkers through. They've never been there before, and I love it. The High Line is, for me, my favorite part of New York City, aside from maybe like doing a lot more eating than I probably should. But it's a wonderful, I'm out in the middle. It's an old railroad trellis that goes through Manhattan that they've turned into this kind of walkable park. And part of the design of this garden is matrix design. Okay, so if we're looking at that left picture, you're going to see a lot of green. You're going to see a lot of things kind of peeking up. Things, things like that are really how it kind of works out. On the right, if you've been to Chicago and the Millennium Park, here's another example of kind of matrix gardening, and again, it looks a little wild, but then there's also some patterns there from there. Can you see my slides? You can't see my slide? Let me try sharing them again. Okay, both of these parks were designed by a Dutch landscape designer named Piet Oudolf. And he's been somebody that probably in the last, I'll be for certain for longer than that, but in this country, about the last 15 to 20 years, has really worked within matrix gardening to bring it. And he certainly has a lot of work that he's done over in Europe as well. Okay, onward we go. Now, the US garden aesthetic on the left here, and now I'm pulling some punches, is kind of like there's a lot of this, it's kind of like what you get when you go to Red Lobster, right? It's like that, like the landscaping outside of an Olive Garden. There's usually like 6 inches of mulch around maybe some shrubs and some plants that look like they're struggling. All right. And generally speaking, you see a lot of this. I mean, I like mulch too. I like that, the reason people mulch tends to be is to keep the weeds down. When you do something like 6 inches of mulch, you run the risk that the weeds will just start growing out of the top 2, inches of mulch, which, it's like, why are you doing this to begin with? And then also it has that way of kind of keeping and diminishing the plants that are around it. So in this case, if that's a boxwood and maybe some cypress or whatever, they stay very, very low to the ground. They're not growing. They're not, voluptuous by any means, so, but that also means that they need very little care from a landscaper that you're coming to pay. So this is kind of the aesthetic, that we know. We like a lot of mulch. We like things to be a little farther apart. If you go to Home Depot, you buy a plan, it tells you right there, this should be 3 feet tall. You should space these things 36 inches apart. That's kind of the thought. So, okay, well, then we'll have these little islands, and that's one way to garden. And there's like nothing wrong with that necessarily. But on the right, this is more of, and I'm assuming both of these pictures seem to be about the same time, about the middle of spring, early spring. This is a little wilder, but I think there's just more to look at. So even if you look at this right picture here, and if you've read The Day That the Crayons Quit, you know that there's a lot of depth to the color brown. And you can see that here in the tan and the beige and things along those lines that really, really pop up. And, this is, to me, at least, in my opinion, when you look at the right, you see more, there's just more to look at, and it's something that I enjoy looking at. And you can imagine that if the wind blows in the right picture, you can see some waviness that go through there. The wind blows on the left, there ain't nothing happening. History of matrix gardening is obviously, I mean, this is a natural concept, so it's been going on for millennia, but the history of actually like matrix gardening really grew out of Europe post World War II. There was a lot of devastation and destruction, and like frankly, just a lot of open area. So there was an idea that they wanted more parkland, and they wanted a way to try to keep the dust down, and then they needed something that was easy to build and maintain. And so this idea was, what if we just have this small garden plan? And let's say it's a 10 by 10, maybe it was 100 by 100, and we show you what all the plants are going to be. I can give this plan to somebody else, and they can go and they can make it. And if it needs to be 600 square feet, then we'll just put 6 of them, and just keep doing it for the 6 things. If it's 100,000, whatever, you kind of get the idea. But the idea being is that you can kind of plan this once, and you could give this plan to my 9-year-old daughter, and then she would be able to go and just be like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to put this plan here and put the, things along those lines. So that's kind of where the matrix, as a necessity in Europe kind of grew. It's like, how do you keep the dust down? We want to make some parkland here, but then also, what's going to be the easiest to maintain? Is just a picture here. As you can see, if you're looking down through, you could kind of see these wafts. We're going to go into more about what makes this, but you can see there are things that are poking up. You've got cone flowers peeking up over there. You've got this waft of it looks like maybe some like spotted bee balm, and then in the back you have Culver's fruit, those things that look like pitchforks in the back, kind of out there. So there's a lot for your eye to see, but it's also not, there's not a lot of visual noise either. You don't look at this, you're like, I don't know what I'm looking at. Your eye just kind of goes and glazes over it. This is from the The High Line, again, they kind of, I guess they kept some of the railroad lines and stuff like that and planted in between them and things like that. So I'm just showing it off because again, I love the place. If you look at this, what's the majority color that you see? This is over in Chicago, Millennium Park. You know, the one color that you see is probably the most of the time here is green. All right. There is a lot of green in matrix gardening. All right. Green is my favorite color, so that's useful. But green is also kind of a soothing color. Um, you know, it's easy on the eyes. It puts you at ease. When you're dealing with putting a matrix that's mostly green, there's still a lot to see because there's different variations and things along those lines, but there's going to be a lot of green. And we'll talk about how we do that using green mulch. Benefits of matrix gardening before we get into the show, you know, it tends to be cheaper over time. You need less maintenance, less resources. You don't have to mow it like your lawn every week. You know, the most you would ever have to do is to really cut it down once a year, you know, if you do that at all. By designing kind of a matrix garden grid, you'll know the exact number and type of plants that you need. So you can say, if my space is X amount, then I'm going to need this amount of plants if I'm going to follow my plan, which is different than, you know, I certainly have done a lot of too. You kind of go to the store and you just buy a few things, whatever. That makes it easier to budget and to say, all right, this is the exact amount I need. Less maintenance, again, that you don't have to be out there like watering morning and night. You don't have to be out there changing plants out and saying like, well, these are only good, these are annuals, so every year I got to bring them in. You know, you shouldn't have to edit too much going in and moving things around. It ends up being an ecosystem powerhouse. So it's a place where, you know, plants and animals are, you know, being born, living, dying every day. And there's very few of those places around anymore. Drawbacks are, and just to let you know, and you may feel this by the end of it, this does take some planning. You have to do your homework. You got to do some research. You have to start learning some of these plants. You know, you have to put some time into this. It does take longer to establish. So the plan really calls for growing from seed or growing from plugs, which are 1 year plants. Okay, so it just takes longer. So it's not going to look done when you walk. It's going to look like, you know, it's immature. It's going to look like a teenager. And maybe harder to find some native species. Okay, so if you walk into Home Depot, you may not be able to find all these plants. I'll give you some examples of where you can find them. You know, but it's not as easy as walking into the hardware store and being able to find some of these. And it does require care in the first year. Sometimes I talk to people about native plant gardening and they're like, hey, it's great. I throw them in the ground, don't have to do anything. I mean, I mean, it's like 98 degrees out right now or whatever. You know, these things, particularly when you first put them in the first year, need care. They need water. They need some weeding, things along those lines. It gets easier over time, but the first year you're going to have to do a little bit. So the first plan you do is you kind of start with a 10 by 10 graph. You can open this up in Excel. You can get yourself a piece of graph paper. You can use something like SketchUp, you know, but it's good to think about matrix gardening in a 10 by 10 area, even if you don't have a 10 by 10 area, or if you know exactly the parameters for the garden that you're trying to grow, you know, you can kind of add that and you could say, okay, well, it's a strip of land that's 2 feet by 20 feet that goes up my sidewalk, or, you know, I live in Lawrenceville and it's my little front yard and it's a, you know, it's a 5 by 5 or whatever the case may be. You can also use these things. On the left is what Pete Aldorf uses. You know, he pulls out the colored pencil and he makes these things. Some people do these designs and they look really great. They're artistic. They're showing like what it looks like from the side view. You know, I like his because he just makes little shapes. You know, he has a legend and he says anything with the X over it is this plant and the green ones are this plant. I mean, I kind of like that. That works for me. On the right is Benjamin Vogt, who's from Nebraska, who's big into like the prairie movement. He just has a piece of graph paper with some colored pencils and then like where it says RH, that's Rebecca Herta, that's Black-Eyed Susan. So you put like 3 of them there and then that's it. Okay, so, you know, you don't need a lot of artistic skill. I certainly don't, you know, and I've done this in like, of all things, Excel, and I've also used graph papers in my own house. All right, let's get into like the different layers. Generally speaking, There's 3 layers, and we're going to go into them. And you can kind of see it on this side. On the side here, up the side, this is from Thomas Rainier. He's an American-based landscape designer who works with matrix gardenings quite a bit. So we're going to start at the bottom and work our way up. The matrix layer is the ground cover layer, is kind of that bottom layer. This is your green mulch. Okay, so once established, if you are someone who uses mulch, you won't need mulch. Okay, because we're building in a place where you're not going to need the mulch to keep down the weeds, because there's going to be enough stuff there. You're not going to need the mulch to keep in the moisture, because there's going to be enough organic material that's already there. This is really going to fill in the gaps of everything. So there's not going to be a lot of space. So you won't be able to see too much dirt under there. It's going to shade out the weeds. So the first year, you're probably going to have to pull weeds. But the second year, the weeds are going to have a hard time getting a foothold. Because they're going to be in a race for water. They're going to be in a race for sunlight, and things along those lines. So, this green mulch is really going to, going to be hard for weeds to get through. In a smaller area, you use 1 species of plant for this. If you have a larger area, you can try to work with 2. But you're going to be planting one of these plants every foot. Every 12 inches is going to be one of these things, normally bunch grasses. So it's going to be lined up that way. And then generally speaking, the matrix layer is going to be 60% to 70% of all the plants that you are going to have an opportunity to put in. Okay, so some people are like, I don't want to plant grass. I want to plant plants that have big blooms for the bees and the butterflies and all that. Absolutely, that's great. But this is going to look really good. Okay, it's going to have that meadow look, which is interesting, and I think you're going to enjoy looking at. B, it's going to help keep down the weeds, so that those plants too will have a better chance of surviving and thriving and doing things along those lines. And C, like we talked about with bunch grasses and all, for native pollinators in particular, you're establishing some habitat for them to overwinter and then survive into the next year. 2 options of getting these in. On the left is a plug. You can get these plugs usually in trays of 38, 50, or 72. That tends to be the numbers. You get a tray of them and you just be like, all right, I'm gonna get this 1 species, you get this. Generally, I get them online. You can get them online, and then they'll ship them to your house. You open them up, you water them, and you're good to go. I love using plugs because when you put it in, you know that there's something there, and it's already alive. So when you come back a week later or whatever, you're not like, I don't know, is that a weed? Is that like, I don't know what it is. So you kind of have some feelings that way. So the plugs, so you could think about, you can get plugs of bunch grass. Or you could get plugs of milkweed. You could do things like that. But anyway, if you buy a tray of 50 plugs, you're going to have 50 little plants that you can start lining up from there. Your other option is you can use seed. You can go and you can buy single species seed from a respectable place. And then you can broadcast that over your garden area, water it down, and kind of see what happens from there. Now, that won't be as uniform as lining it up and saying, every foot I've got this bunch grass, every foot I have this thing. It's going to be a little more randomized, but it's certainly cheaper. So, if a tray of plugs could be, $150. 4 ounces of seed can be like $8. From there, I wouldn't use wildflower seed, quote unquote, or anything along those lines, single species, because if you're like me, when I'm looking at it, I don't know what I might look at it and be like, is this a weed or is this like what I want to grow? I don't know. So, I tend not to use the seed, or to use like a mix of seeds too much. Some suppliers for plugs and seed are places like Prairie Moon or Prairie Nursery. You could put those into Google, take a look. Isle Plants is a wholesaler of plugs, where you get to pick like, okay, what species do you want, and then in what quantity, and then they kind of work through that. Ernst Seed was up in Meadville. They specialize in wildflower seeds and things along those lines. You can check those out too. Here's some examples of possible green mulch in the matrix. I'm giving you both the name and also like the Latin name, and some people roll their eyes about the Latin name, but really, some people go and they like change the names of this stuff. Or if you go into Home Depot, you don't know what this plant is, because it's called like whatever, something ridiculous. If you have the Latin name, then you know exactly it goes back to this, which can be really, really useful from here. So just kind of keep that in mind. If we've all memorized all the songs and all the lyrics to Hamilton, you too can also memorize a couple plants and get to know, some of the Latin words too. So here's 4 of them. Little blue stem is a great one. If you look at this, you can see there's this like bluish greenish tint to it. It's gorgeous about mid summer. And then as midsummer goes to fall, it starts to get these little seed heads that come over, like these little hairs that come out. It's really gorgeous, about 3 feet tall. Down below it, Cytosgrama, as you can see here, this is kind of late summer, so it's nice and green. And then you get that kind of like wheat, that wheat look. I don't know, something along those lines. You get the seed heads that come out. It's an interesting way, and it looks really neat, particularly in mass, as you can see here. That gets to only about 2 feet, so it's not too high either. Up at the top on the right is prairie drop seed. It's this like bright green, like lime green. And it's got this like, Andy Warhol kind of like wildness to it, which is really nice. But it's like this almost like fluorescent green that goes through. All those are great in sun, part shade. Sedges at the bottom right from the Carex species are really good for shady areas. Okay, so you can get, and there's any number of different sedges that you can look at with different seed heads and different shapes and do things like that. But that if you have a shady place or underneath really trees or whatever else like that, you can use something along those lines. This is from Thomas Rainier. I think we talked about him. This is how he would do it. I said that like, because this is the way my line works. Like when I'm planting, I like those straight lines of bunch grass, straight lines of Cytosgrama, going down. He here in his, kind of look here for this visualization, he's a lot more scattering. So this could be either seeds or even scattering the plugs around. And here he's used 2 species. You can do that too. If it's a small garden, stick to 1. If you've got a big area, you could potentially, if you wanted to get fancy, add 2 species. You could have prairie drop seed and you could have, blue stem or whatever you want to do from there. And you don't have to have it in the lines. Like if that doesn't jive for you, then, I wouldn't worry about it. All right, the middle layer is the seasonal layer. What we're looking for here is that parade of native perennial blooms. We really want to try in this layer that there's something that is blooming at there's always something blooming, early on. The patterns here follow nature. So we start thinking about how the seeds work. Okay, so how would these seeds work in nature? Are they just fall or are they wind blown? And then also some of the structures of roots and how the roots work and things along those lines. We want seasonal interest all year. So we want to pick the plants that are going to look great all year, even when they're dead in the winter. And this will comprise about 30% of your plants. Okay, these little plants, they're going to be peeking out over the your matrix layer. So here Thomas Rainier talks about clustering. You can see here that there's like the blue and then there's this purple and kind of this like darkish like charcoal color from here. This is kind of clustering. This is what we call drifting, which we'll get into. So it's plants that are kind of making this drift. There's more than one. There should always be more than one plant of the same kind. You don't want like, I just have one of this, one of this, and one of this, even in a small garden. You want to have, I always say like at least 3 of the same type of plants because that's easier on the pollinators and it also looks great. So clusters. So plant species that would naturally stay together. This is generally bulb-based or rhizomous root systems. Okay, so just like if you've ever planted daffodils, unless a squirrel digs one up and moves it over here, they're generally going to stay in the same area of your garden as where you planted them. They may grow out, okay, you may have more, but you're not going to find one here and then, one like, 3 feet away. Plants placed in close proximity in groups of 3 to 5. So even if you look at this picture on the right, you'll see the sedum at the bottom. That's got to be at least 3 or 4 plants. If you look up and you see the purple cone flower a little higher up, that's got to be at least 3 or 4 plants there too. Okay, so it makes kind of this statement of putting these plants together from there. And by close proximity, I mean about a foot apart, maybe even less. All right. So again, when you look at the tag and it tells you it's got to be 2 feet apart, we ain't doing that. We're keeping stuff really, really tight. Then you want to scatter those clusters 3 times. So if we go back to this one, you'll see he's got like some here, and then a couple feet away, he's got another one, and like, stuff like that. You want to scatter those clusters around as well. And then 3 to 5 species over the bloom time. If you have a large garden, if you have a small one, we can cut that down. There's no big deal, but you always want something. You want something coming up in the spring. You want something coming up in the summer, and you want something coming up in the fall. And if you can kind of get some of those shoulder areas, like late spring, early summer, early fall, the more the better. Some options to think about for these are some of my favorites. For spring is Golden Alexander, that gets to 3 feet tall. It's got these little yellow, almost like Queen Anne's lace, or like you get from a carrot, because they're all kind of connected. Yeah, they're related somehow. But it's a gorgeous plant. It stays straight up. I've never had any issues with it flopping over. This is also a host plant for the black swallowtail butterfly, which is one of my favorite butterflies. In the summer, so you put 3 of those together, it really puts on a great show, come April, May. In the summer, anise hyssop, again, another one of my favorites. Rabbits, never had any issue with rabbits nibbling on this because of the way, I guess, the foliage tastes. You have these spikes that come up, these lavender spikes. This can get lost in a busy garden, but if you put 3 or more of them together, you can't miss it. And certainly the pollinators don't miss it either. Purple coneflower, we've seen a lot of that. You're going to continue seeing it. I feel like purple coneflower is the gateway drug to native plants, because it's like, oh, I know that one. And if you know that one, then you'll get to know the other ones. These look great in the wintertime too. When they're dead, they just stick straight up. They'll have little snow on top of them. The birds will eat the seeds. It's really great. And then in the fall, I have zigzag goldenrod. Goldenrods are a keystone species. Goldenrods are it's so important for migrating butterflies and other pollinators. It's a great opportunity for them, to kind of fuel up on their way south. So, try to work some goldenrod into your gardens. All right, drifters. So this is a sweeping group of plants heading in the general direction. If you look at this stock picture over here, you'll see the liatris in the bottom, the blazing stars, which are great. Those are good clumpers. But in the back, you see purple prairie clover. Okay, they've got these cute little blooms that are purple. If you just have one of these in your garden, you're gonna miss it. You can't see it. There's like too much other stuff going on. But if you make a drift of it and you make like 8 of them together, 10 of them together, like kind of in this, undulating pathway, you can't miss it. And you're like, wow, that looks awesome. So, that's a drift, and that's a good plant to drift. This is imitating kind of windblown small seeds. That if the wind blows this way, takes some of the seeds. It could potentially be that this is the great grandma plant. This is the, grandma plant, mother plant, kid plants. That's kind of how it would work in nature. This is particularly great for dainty flowers that has like really small flowers. It's an excellent opportunity, to kind of showcase those and to make sure that they stand out. And we're talking like 6 to 12 plants. We're talking like a bunch of plants to make a drift from a couple different species, so you get some blooming throughout the year. In spring, you could use Jacob's ladder. That gets to be about 1.5 feet tall. That's pretty little, but it'd be okay beside your sidewalks or whatever from there. Columbine. I'll tell you a story that on my own garden in the front, I've got about 5 columbine plants, but they're not together. They're spread out. And this year you couldn't see them There's just so much other stuff. But if you put them together, you'll be able to see the columbines and they'll pop. And also the pollinators appreciate that too, because the pollinators try to be as efficient as possible. So they want big drifts of this. That's what pulls them in. That's when they go tell their friends, hey, I've got a plate, I've got a better place for it to get this going on. In the summer, on the right-hand side, hairy beard tongue is great, particularly for that kind of late spring, early summer blooms. They're really, really small blooms that are kind of, purple with a white tip. They almost seem to glow in the dark. It's a wonderful thing. You put, 8 of those together, it really, really pops. Hoary mountain mint is another one. All mints are somewhat aggressive, so you may have to do some editing or cut down at times. But generally, it's running just like a mint would. With the rise of its roots, it would just start taking off in a certain direction. But it's great, particularly for late summer, to having those nice white blooms in the garden. Solos, this is the last part we're going to talk about for the seasonal layer. This is sporadic placement. This is wind-driven seeds, or maybe seeds that birds have pooped out. They ate something, they flew 5 feet away, and then they poop out the seed, and then it blooms there. But these are generally things that can stand out on their own without being too high. So this is generally about your 3 foot, 2 feet to 3 foot layer. But things that could stand out on your own. If you look at this picture, all that orange is butterfly weed. Butterfly weed is a wonderful plant. If you've ever worked with milkweed seeds and you open up the pods, you have all these seeds and they're all connected to this like silky parachute thing, kind of like a dandelion or whatever. If you throw them up in the air, they float. So generally speaking, what you're trying to mimic is that you can have a butterfly weed here, butterfly weed here, butterfly weed here. And the orange sticks out well enough that you really don't, you don't need more of them. You know what I mean? So they can do that and hold on their own. Anytime you have a butterfly weed, you're going to see it because it's one of the only, native orange blooms that we get. In spring, now, I try not to be a zealot, but I use daffodils, which are not from around here. They're exotic, whatever, but it's like, come on, man, at the end of our winters, I need something. So I will oftentimes put daffodils in my gardens. And, send your complaints to the complaint office, right? But I need that. It looks good. There's something coming up from there. In the summer, the butterfly weed is great, again, because of those purple blooms, or not purple blooms, the orange blooms. In the fall, aromatic aster is a wonderful kind of solo plant. If you plant 4 or 5 of these, if you have the room, they come up. They're almost like a big globe of a plant. They grow in like a globe shape. They're covered with those aster blooms that are purple. It looks really great. And again, it can stand out on itself. This is what Thomas Rainier has to see. You could see that he's kind of placed these different things around too. He's got some of those drifts we talked about, also some clumpers, and then also those solos with the orange, which I bet I would put money down. He's talking about butterfly weed as well. Structural layer is the top layer. This, we're looking for year-round interest. It can be taller perennials or shrubs or trees. Okay, so this doesn't have to look like the Great Plains either. If that's not what you want to do, you can add shrubs, you can add trees, things along those lines. And this is generally going to be about 10% of your plants. This is what Thomas Rainier would do. This is a little more than I'd probably do. I guess it depends on what the plan is. I mean, I'm not doing that with the things, but who am I to say? In the spring, some options for you, the indigos, the Baptisia family, you can get these and they're like these pea-like blooms, which are gorgeous in the springtime. They come in blue, white, yellow, Lord knows what else. So it's a great it's just a great looking plant. It's a slow grower, but it's almost like a shrub, and it's covered in the spring with these blooms. And then once those blooms are pollinated, they turn into these jet black seed pods, which look great for the rest of the year. They look great in the wintertime. It's a good time. Another spring thing you can plant is any native tree or shrub. Before the native perennials start blooming in kind of the mid to late spring, native bees and queens and things along those lines are really coming up from they're relying on maple trees, they're relying on willows, things along those lines. In the summer, rattlesnake master is a great one. You can see from the Latin, it looks like a yucca plant. It looks like an agave. It gets to about 5 feet. It's got these really crazy blooms that look like microphones. Joe Pye weed's another good one that can get to 5 feet. If it is in like a very wet and but sunny location, that thing could grow to like 12 feet, for late summer blooms. In the fall, northern blazing star is great. This thing is covered with monarchs. We have two of these, and all three. We have two of these, and it's not uncommon for us to walk out on the front porch and see 5 monarch butterflies in the fall, vying for the blooms on here. New England aster is another thing. That thing could go up to 5 or 6 feet. So it's a good architectural plant. It's very beautiful and it's great for pollinators. The idea for the matrix then is once you have this 10 by 10 plan or whatever you want to do, you could do something like this. If you needed to expand, you could put that plan side by side, or you could turn it 90 degrees, 90 degrees, 90 degrees. But within each of those clusters in your plan, then this is where I would want to put these plans, and then this is how many that I need, to go to from there. Here's another simple plan for Benjamin Vogt. Again, kind of going through, if you look at this, again, you could use Excel for this. The green that you see there, that's the matrix layer. And then the orange you can see there, those are the solos. And the yellow, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, those are the clumpers. And then you have your drifters, and here it looks like he's drifting. Maybe not really drifting much of any of these. He's got the clumps, which is okay too. If you don't want to, if you just want to clump, you could clump as well. But you also see that there's empty space, or not empty space, but there's just green space. And that's okay too, right? Because that's how it would look. I put some parameters into AI in the Copilot, and then this is what I got. I said to design a matrix garden, a 10 by 10 matrix garden using PA native plants. And it actually gave me this plant list. And this is directly from using Copilot, it shows you where the work's from. This from Monarch Gardens in Benjamin Vogt out in Nebraska. I did this in Chat GPT, and then this is what came up. I don't know how useful this is, but this is what this is what it gave me just for a hoot. So you could also use AI to, somewhat start your garden, but AI is not going to dig it up for you. Some planting parameters to keep in mind. If it's under 100 square feet, probably about 5 species of plant is all you need, okay? If you get too many types of plants, your eye, there's like visual noise that's hard to compensate. And you look at it, it's like, I don't know, like your eyes just can't figure out what's going on. The green of that of the matrix layer really helps your eye kind of follow it and bring some ease that way. You want something always in bloom during the growing season. The grasses are going to allow for that continuity in the refuge. Shorter plants in the front, 1.5 to 2 feet, taller plants in the back. Try to keep, aside from some of those architectural plants, the 3 feet or less, okay? Just, because chances are, if you're like me and I live in town, it can get overruly if you're talking about a lot of compass plant or prairie dock or stuff like that gets up to like 12 feet. If you have a 3-foot plant, that should be 3 feet from the sidewalk, okay? So if you want to use some larger plants, make sure it's at least 3 feet back from the sidewalk. You can mulch 1 to 2 inches the first year for seed, for weed suppression, but just 1 to 2 inches, none of the 6-inch stuff. Just a little bit from there, but you may not have to do that. And then prepare to edit it. And by editing, I mean you may have to come in and add more plants, or maybe you don't love that plant. You give it away and you get some new plants. Or, one's getting a little more aggressive than the others and you got to cut it back. I mean, that's the fun of gardening, right? It's like getting in there and doing some of this stuff. Planting in the spring or fall is best. Fall is particularly a wonderful time to plant because this ground is warm. So that first year, particularly with plugs, it's almost all root growth. All right. So that nice warm, like the ground will stay warm until Thanksgiving. So even after that frost and everything else, there's going to continue to be a lot of work underneath the ground. Spring is also fine. I would not plant anything at all this week, that's for sure. Water twice per week for 1 month. you know, more if it's really dry or if it's 98 degrees like it is here, you're going to need the weed. You need to learn what your weeds are. You got to go in and pull them up, you know, and that's it. Keep everything up. Don't clean up your garden in the fall. You know, don't go in and cut everything down and do whatever else. I always wait till the red buds are blooming. So the red bud tree, when it's blooming in April, that tells me that the native pollinators are no longer hibernating and they're out and about, which then leads me to believe that I can cut down all that grass. I can cut down that stuff. I leave all that stuff in the garden. That becomes the compost. I don't put that in bags. I don't do anything else. I cut it and it just lays where it lays. And then, you know, to just be prepared to edit from there. You do need to be patient about this. We're coming up to the end here. In year one, this is what your garden's going to look like if you're using plugs, okay? 1 year plants. Most of the growth in a 1 year perennial plant is underground that you can't see. You're going to see a couple of inches up top, you know, and everything else is underground because it has to get that extensive root network to survive the winter and to get ready for next year. So it's going to look a little goofy. It's going to look a little immature. But the next year, you're going to be about half size. So if you look at the next picture, you know, stuff's starting to come up. It's starting to look like real plants. You probably get about half to 75% of the blooms you should expect on an adult plant. But then certainly by the third year, this is as big, probably about as big as it's going to get. Then everything's full size. So you do have to be patient and you have to be ready to look at this year one thing and say, hey, it's looking a little, you know, a little crazy there. Couple resources here to keep in mind. These are some books. They're all from the Timber Press of all things. Anything by Doug Tallamy. He's a professor at Delaware, is worth reading. The Living Landscape is an excellent book talking about these different layers in greater detail than I was here. And also talking a lot about nature's best hope. And it's kind of a new look at conservation from there. Pete Aldorf, the Planting the Natural Garden. He has a couple books out. There's a lot of great movies on his work and things along those lines. He tends to mix both like native plants and more exotic plants, which isn't really my thing, but you know, I mean, what he gets is just gorgeous. In this plant in particular has a great listing of plants in the back of the book and just some like really great photography. Thomas Rainier, we talked about Planting in a Post-Wild World, is an excellent book that really, really hits on this place that are there truly wild places left? You know, are there places like that? And if there isn't, how can we garden to try to at least mimic some of what used to be or what is out there? Which I think is an interesting thesis to think about like, well, you know, there's very few wild places left that haven't been touched totally by man. But then how do we kind of build these habitats to keep some of these species going? And then Benjamin Vogt, he's on Instagram. If you're on there too, under Monarch Gardens, I think is his tag. So he puts a lot of stuff out. Prairie Up is a great book. It's very prairie forward, if that's such a phrase. But you know, he's from Nebraska. So he's like, how do you take your lawn and you turn it into plants? And even for us in Pennsylvania, it's a great book. And really like step one, step two, step three of getting rid of your lawn, and then also the types of plants, and even giving some really great suggestions about different plants from there. So, you know, continue to reading and continue looking at these things. And I certainly hope that your garden, you know, I hope that you try this out in a small part of your garden or a large part. And I appreciate you all coming today. I see we have some questions from the chat. Emily writes, do you have advice for soil retention for hillside planting the first year as stuff is getting established? Yeah, I think that, you know, if you do the plugs, you already got a little bit of a jump because they already have some roots in there. It's amazing just how quickly native perennial roots grow. Like I grow some at home and you'll have this much, I don't know if you can see like this much green, but then you'll have 6 inches of roots, you know, from there. The bunch grasses, if you got something like switchgrass, or some of those things from the matrix area, those, I mean, it's incredible just how fast those roots grow. We get used to like lawn grass and it's like this big, but like switchgrass will go down 15 feet. So if you were trying to really stabilize something like that, switchgrass, big blue or little blue stem, not big blue stem probably, you know, are some good places to start. Yeah, the Audubon Society, Dawn, is a great place to buy native plants, absolutely. And they also have a great like online resources of like native plants that let you know, like, oh, I've got this wet area, I should put in a rain, and then like, what should I put in there? That works out. You're absolutely right. And then it's like a twofer. Not only do you get some really well grown native plants, but it also, the money stays with the Audubon Society, which I am a member. Happy to share my slides. I think they generally put this stuff up on the Pitt Sustainability like YouTube channel that you could watch it again if you wanted to. Um, so yeah, so that's good. Are there any other questions? I'm happy you can unmute or you could talk or do whatever. Keep an eye out on, we're coming to the end of pollinator week. Or pollinator month. So keep an eye out. There's still a couple more things that are coming. The YouTube channel has a couple other things dealing with things. We've talked about the lawn to the meadow conversion. There's about starting a rain garden, and how to think about that, and also how to start seeds in the wintertime. So if you really wanted to like save some money, you could start your seeds, right before Christmas and then see what you get in March and things along those lines. As far as rabbits and other critters, things like anise hyssop and the milkweeds, they tend to stay away from. Things that have smelly leaves, I have found. But also, I also know that like if animals are hungry enough, deer are hungry enough, they'll eat just about anything. But I know that I haven't seen any of them ever touch our milkweed, although I've heard other people have had that um thing from there. Christine asked about rototilling. I tend to stay away from that just because every time that you mix up the soil, there tends to be you're bringing other weeds to the surface. So, if like you dig and you start to really disturb the soil. There could be seeds that have been laying there for 10 years, and now they've got light, now they've got moisture, and they start growing from there. Normally, if someone's getting rid of lawn, I tend to tell them to do either, you know, get a sod cutter or really carefully just kind of scrape it off. Or if you have the time and you don't, mind, as my wife would call shantying up the place, you could put down and, a big tarp and lay it down, and you keep that down for about a month. You pull it off, you put it down for another month, things along those lines that kill the stuff that's underneath there. Well, thank you all very much for coming today. I hope that you have a great weekend. I hope that you're staying dry and also cool these times. Again, if there's any other questions, you can always reach out to me here at the university. I'm in the deal. But keep an eye on the YouTube channel, keep an eye and keep up with Pitt Sustainability. They've been doing a great things. And thanks for coming today. We'll catch you all later.